Alright, so this latest chapter of My Hero Academia was interesting to say the very least, and I believe it may very well chart the course for what we may presume to be the conclusion of the series as a whole. With the previous chapter, we began with the sentiment of All for One's will in regards to the potential of New Order and One for All working together, a pairing that more than anything else would serve to thwart his decades of meticulous planning. For the sake of avoiding such a thing, he'd gone to great lengths disabling the Public Safety Commission and even having his allies overseas cause problems. His intended plan was to perfect their body and subsequently seize One for All, the very power that by its lonesome could ruin all his plans. And once he had that, even New Order would have been helpless against him. Really and truly, Star's sudden appearance placed him in an incredibly precarious position that demanded a major gamble. Yet even still, the villain had now emerged victorious and had seized New Order for himself. Star attempted to use it to avoid decaying as the villain simultaneously decayed her body and stole her quirk. But she could only boost her own endurance so much, not to mention that by focusing on her body, she left her quirk open to theft. The villain would then attempt to use the quirk before suddenly being faced by the hero within the Vestige world. As in the present, their body would begin to swell horribly before violently exploding as their quirks were going haywire. As it turns out, at the very last second before being pounced on, Star placed a new rule, that New Order revolts against other quirks, which ultimately resulted in the internal desecration of All for One's Vestige world as several quirks would be torn asunder. Star knew that to pull this off would require quite the sacrifice, and so she was more than willing to give her life in exchange for stopping such a global menace. New Order was now like a raging parasite, one that the villain couldn't simply be rid of, as All for One can only give and take quirks, not destroy them outright. The villain would then be swarmed by laser fire as New Order would manage to successfully destroy their deflect quirk. And so now, desperate for survival, the villain would suddenly sprout wings and take off. With this latest chapter, the villain would continue flying and evade laser fire, as apparently, prior to having the thing blow up, they had taken the Nomu's wing quirk, which they had now decided to employ, as they desperately needed to give New Order to someone else, as otherwise, they would be utterly destroyed from within, because remember, All for One is in this case a quirk as well. Now, as he fled, the villain would recall the prior words of Star as she proclaimed All Might to have been her savior in the past and her inspiration for becoming a hero. A thought that infuriated what we may presume to be the Shigaraki aspect of this fusion, as again and again he simply cannot be rid of All Might's influence. And so now angrily, the winged villain would blast off at accelerated speeds that not even the jets could keep up with. He was gone. One of the remaining pilots at this point would think back to what Star had said to them all at the beginning of the battle, that if any of them were to perish here, she would be sure to return their bodies to their families. Yet with the inverse having happened, there is not even a trace of her left for them to bring back to her family. What was no doubt a painful realization, as the pilot would furthermore think to himself that Star had already long since surpassed All Might, that she was in fact the greatest hero. What I find to be absolutely untrue. I mean, All Might eliminated organized crime in Japan almost entirely and upheld a relative state of peace for decades. His very existence served to shift and influence the status of heroes in the country. If Star had done more than that, it would have been nice to have known before she was, I don't know, deleted, but whatever. Elsewhere, in an abandoned port town nearby, were two escaped convicts attempting to lay low. Apparently, the place they had chosen still had power and running water, which was a major score given the current situation of the country. The TV wasn't working, but then again, it wasn't as if the broadcasters themselves weren't people concerned for their own safety as well. The man's name was Kashi Kashiko, and he was imprisoned for robbery and murder, so maybe not the nicest guy around. Apparently, escaping prison was a pretty demanding task. However, their city was destroyed during the war, and so they were just about ready to enjoy the quiet life in the middle of nowhere. As boom, crashing into the side of the house and sending these two flying, it was the villain, who was at this point ripping at the seams. The immediate thought of these convicts was that a hero had come to bring them back to prison. But they would very quickly realize that the thing before them was more like a monster, as it would express that it still had a chance, deducing what exactly Star had done to New Order. And so the villain sought to take this random person's quirk, and once they were quirkless, pass the power onto them as a means of safely storing it. Essentially what we presume to be the most reasonable and likely course of action. However, just as the villain did this, Star would from within call him a fool. Again, the rule was that New Order would revolt against other quirks. And thanks to them possessing such a wellspring of quirks within themselves, New Order was in ruins on account of the conflict along with plenty of their quirks. She would express her regret in being unable to kill him, however she would leave him with some parting words. That so long as people are still willing to help one another, the will of a hero shall live on. And they would surely bring an end to his reign of terror. All for One's retort would be one centered on survival, crowning himself as the victor as he was the one to survive, as finally the last remnant of Star and Stripe would vanish. As simultaneously deep within the conjoined villain, within an exposed dark spot questioning the presence of a hero, it would be Shimura Tenko, surrounded by several hands, as he would say, the name is Zuko Midoriya. This effectively confirms our recent theory in regards to Tenko being a separate will within the Vestige world. Now with that being said, despite being correct, I'm not really a fan of this. You have to understand that although Tenko is a manifestation of Shigaraki's childhood desires, he is still a part of Shigaraki. And so for him to be presented with the concept of a hero and the first person to come to mind for him is Deku, that's just super weird to me. Shigaraki has only barely recognized the kid's existence, and in pretty much all of those cases it was either about All Might or the quirk One for All. Never just Deku outright, or a recognition of how great of a hero Deku is. If anything, he's recognized All Might and even Eraserhead a whole lot more. It honestly just feels a little corny like this. I mean, Deku has the spirit of a hero, no doubt, but he certainly doesn't have a shining track record when it comes to saving others. He himself admitted that he couldn't do anything for his prior adversaries but punch them into submission. He's also never saved someone cleanly or by his lonesome. To save Eri, Night Eye died and Muriel lost his quirk. To save Kota, he failed to save Bakugo. To save Bakugo later on, Kirishima had to be the one to gain the captive's faith, and All Might lost his power in the end. All in all, the conveyance of this desired point is kinda questionable for me. But moving on, a search party was sent out in search of the villain. But all they managed to find were traces of a Bayside home invasion and conflict. He was gone, and they were too slow to catch up. So yeah, Japan's top 3 are pretty damn useless. News of Star's death spread the world over in a single day. The unanimous sentiment from every other nation being that if the world's strongest hero couldn't stop him, nobody could. And so they'd all withdraw their forces. As in Egypt, we would have Salam from movie 3 being incredibly upset with this course of action. It was every nation for itself at this point, as the entire world would suspend overseas deployment immediately and indefinitely. However, Star's brothers in arms would appear before All Might and the police force, telling them that Star's sacrifice was not in vain, as All Might would express his disappointment with not being able to see her again. However, the X-66 jets that they flew in captured a record of the battle. During this time, they were able to measure the villain's biological processes and have an onboard analysis of his quirk. Information which would surely prove to be invaluable, as previously, they never actually had a chance to study his body in any way. But the following day, which was just 2 days after Deku's return to UA, All Might would inform the students that in reality, Shigaraki's completion was set to be tomorrow. However, thankfully, they were provided one final delay on account of Star's sacrifice, which would in theory provide them another week. They now have 7 days to prepare for the final battle, as we see the light has officially returned to Deku's eyes, and that was the chapter. Very interesting stuff. If you notice, all our students were already suited up or in the process of doing so. Deku is over here in his gym uniform on account of his costume destruction, but this is most definitely a temporary thing. But you know what? Now that Star's portion of the story has concluded, how do we all feel about her inclusion? Please let us know in the comments. As far as I'm concerned, Star in her totality was a plot device, and a poorly disguised one at that. Anyone reading this story, even without analyzing the content as we do, could have predicted this very outcome. Perhaps not every minute detail, mind you, but the major takeaways for sure. The fact that she was going to die, the villain wouldn't, and she would in some way nerf him. I'm honestly glad this fight is over, because frankly, for a whole lot of fans, it is very clearly a low point. and that's despite the insanity of the powers involved and such. It really and truly just comes down to execution and track record, which for a lot of people took away a bit of that enjoyment. A fight that when adapted by the anime will probably be like 2 episodes or so, 3 if they're really stretching things. But we already know that when it comes to this series the kids sell, so I doubt that they would really want to stretch it. And speaking of, hopefully the return of Class 1A will get the people going again. But I will say that these precise time designations are really interesting. What an interesting freshman year of school. But yeah, it seems like we will have 1 more week followed by the final event of the story. Now, if you'd like to be here for all that and more, be sure to subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on. Because when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm Sliceable Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.